Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've seen from a distance the online version. I've been electronically in touch with the Orpheus Institute, so it's great to actually come here and see what it is. A couple of just explanatory things. I've put my phone here to record myself narcissistically because I don't have a script. And just occasionally, I say something that comes out just right and I surprise myself. And when that happens, I can go back to my recording and think, what was it I said? That came out just right. So that's what that's for. That's pointing at me, not pointing at you. And then the second thing, I've worked for a long time at the University of Hertfordshire in a school called the School of Creative Arts. And in that school, we've got not exactly a music school, we have music courses. So in my various roles to do with research, I've had some professional engagement with people whose main subject interest is music. My background is visual arts and fine art, painting and sculpture, and also the philosophy of art. And so I've got a kind of mixed experience, and one of the things I'm hoping to get out of today is to hear in our conversation the kind of examples and indeed the kind of discourse that you use when talking about research that might be a bit different from either what's going on in Britain or what's going on in a predominantly visual arts school and so on. So there's something in it for me. And what I'm going to talk about after the sort of introductory things are some issues that I'm investigating myself, so I thought it would just be interesting to share those with you. There might be something in it for me in your responses, but it's very much as a work in progress, which I thought might be helpful to stimulate discussion, because basically I haven't made up my mind about these things, so we're all in the same position in regard to some of these problems and issues. But in the invitation that I received, the suggestion was I did a very short, I think very might even have been in capital letters, very short introduction. So I thought I'd start with that, and the view, I suppose, the view of what the issue is about research and its relationship to art. So I'm going back a little bit, just briefly, where certainly in Britain and at a defined moment in 1992, but there was a kind of global movement around that time where a lot of previously vocational or practical activities, such as art, maybe music, dance and various other things, were moved into a more academic environment, were moved into universities or gained additional academic status, gained the ability to award doctoral degrees. All of this supported and motivated by the European Union, amongst others, and an idea that there should be a common concept for doctoral studies and research across national borders and a certain degree of standardisation, I suppose. All of that was from my experience, being caught up in it, being in an art school that moved first of all into a polytechnic but then almost immediately became a university, was that suddenly the entire environment in which we were working academically changed. So one thing perhaps to flag up immediately about this is when we're talking about research and creative arts, visual arts, music, I think we are talking about something that many people would regard as an exclusively academic problem. This is only a headache if you work in a university or an institute, if you're a performer, if you're an independent professional, you perhaps are not touched by this or troubled by this. So this whole discourse around research is something that's very centred on a set of problems that are academic problems, dealt with academically, and arising in academia. So we could regard this whole discussion as a bit of an artificial thing that we could either engage with out of sort of philosophical or academic interest, or we could reject altogether as being nothing to do with the professional business of making music or art. And one of the things that happened right at the beginning was that people had to define what research was, develop terminology, make definitions, especially in the environment in which doctorates were awarded, because a doctorate is obviously a specific award for a specific thing from a university, normally the highest award that they give, so it's not unreasonable to ask the university, what do you give it for? In other words, what are the criteria for awarding a doctorate? And I'm using doctorate as an example because in most fields, the way that this sort of term has developed, is this is a training to become a researcher. So if we're thinking in one, with kind of one view that we're interested in research, not just doctorates, I'm proposing to say a little bit about doctorates because doctorates are a training to become a researcher, the formalised version of training. So I guess you might have an informal version of research. Maybe that's something that artists and musicians have always done. Or maybe it's something that you don't need a PhD to do. Or if you've trained by having a PhD or the equivalent doctoral degree, maybe you've been given certain tools but not necessarily all of them. And one of the things that came out of these early days was a definition. This is actually the wording from my own university, but I would say 3/4 of the universities in Britain would be perfectly happy with exactly that wording to define what warrants a PhD, what warrants a doctorate in a particular subject. So the normal formulation in Britain, and this is not just confined to Britain, but I won't promise that this is exactly applicable anywhere else, but a significant original contribution to knowledge or its interpretation is where it started, which is a nice kind of compact description. And I would say in the 1990s, everyone was focused on that bit that I've put in bold. Everyone thought the trick here, the catch, the thing that we've got to do is to demonstrate that we've contributed to knowledge or its interpretation. Because that word knowledge is a kind of loaded word. I mean, we recognise it, I think, from about 2,500 years of Western intellectual history since Plato. Okay, knowledge is something, this is a big thing, we've got to watch out if we're going to do that. Very much the province of universities. Universities, control, authorise, legitimise forms of knowledge. There's a whole theory of knowledge, there's a philosophy of knowledge. You can go to a section in the library and find stuff about knowledge. So if you're not sure what it is, other people have already thought about this. But then, because knowledge also suggests, I think, or does in English anyway, it somewhat connotes factual knowledge, objective knowledge, the kind of knowledge that we're used to in the sciences. This word didn't really fit exactly, I don't think, with these other, let's call them softer disciplines. I don't mean any of these terms to be value terms, just a way of differentiating things. But psychology, sociology, visual art, all sorts of people, I think, would not have said, well, knowledge is a term that we recognise, knowledge is what we do. And interpretation is very commonly paired with knowledge in these definitions of what is required to achieve a doctorate, because it suits less factually based disciplines, disciplines that are to do with interpretations, in which there are many possible interpretations that are equally valid according to a frame of reference or a perspective that one takes on a topic, whereas, which I say is interpretation, whereas knowledge, I think, suggests that there's right and there's wrong. This bit's true, this bit is false. So we can discuss that a bit later on if you want. They probably blur one into the other in certain frameworks. But we've got some extreme here, and the idea was to accommodate both of those ideas about what it is to find out something new, to grow a discipline, generally how things advance, can we say? That's not a very comfortable word either. Then, by about 2000, we saw the emergence of practice as a route to knowledge. So traditionally, I think the PhD in the disciplines that have been in the universities for several hundred years emphasised the idea of theory building. And theory building, again, is not really linked so well, I don't think, with interpretation. And certainly theory building tends to encourage a divide between theory and practice. Now, in Britain, the politicians were interested in increasing the practical utility of research and bangs per buck, the impact of the money, taxpayers' money they were spending on research in terms of practical benefit. And it became clear that the real hotbeds of development in terms of impact and society, the goods that we have, the way that we live and interact, the source was not really in the universities. It was in companies like Apple and Google and places like that. They were the people, who were not universities, that were creating new things that had tremendous impact on how we live. And I think this overall awareness, not just confined to politicians, but in business schools as well, and all sorts of areas, refocused attention away from universities as being the place where you would go if you wanted to find out how to make something new, to commercial research and development, to the role that practice, know-how, expertise, experience, all of those things, what they contribute and how they contribute. So business schools particularly paid a lot of attention to how expert communities came together to make something new, rather than the lone genius, the isolated boffin scientist doing experiments or coming up with theories. So there's a big change. It's sometimes called the practice turn, which I would say began 10 or 15 years ago, something like that. And in Britain, in some other countries as well, I'm not sure about Belgium, there are things called, what are they called? Professional doctorates, which are practice-led doctorates with the aim of making, the second thing, a significant original contribution to practice, in fine art, in music, whatever it is. So there the idea is not so much that the contribution is going to be a theoretical one, it's not necessarily going to change our frameworks of thinking, it's going to impact how we do things. And as a practical example of that would be in my university, for a long time we've had a professional doctorate in engineering. This is aimed at people who are employed in engineering, and one of the big companies that we work with is the Ford Motor Company. Now the Ford Motor Company, I don't have Mr. Ford here to agree or disagree, but I don't think they are principally interested in the theory of automotive manufacture. They want to know how to make a better car, a cheaper car, a more environmental car, that's what we'd like to think. But basically they are interested in some kind of practical outcome that's going to be profitable, but also perhaps beneficial in some other way. So they would be perfectly satisfied, indeed they would deem it some form of success, I think, if there was a department in their company that developed new ideas that were never theorised, that nobody ever looked at the philosophy of automotive engineering, or perhaps some subatomic theory about how it all worked and fitted together and made less pollution. But if it could come straight out of that department onto the production line and result in a better car, quicker, more cheaply than the competition, that's good enough. That's a form of success. And courtesy of sort of world economic crisis, I think many people would go along with that. There's a lot of enthusiasm for that kind of productivity in contrast with what is perceived sometimes as a kind of abstract ivory tower way of developing ideas. So just going back to this idea of a significant original contribution, bearing in mind what I've just said, that there's perhaps more than one way to approach this, according to whether you are theory-driven, pragmatic, profit-driven, whether you're interested in practice, or whether you're interested in the tradition of just rational thought and argumentation that you might think belong to the doctorate. I think there are a number of ways that you can interpret this, and I'm going to characterise them by misinterpretations. So one misinterpretation of what it would be if you were trying to get a doctorate, that you wanted to make a significant original contribution, is significant means big. This has got to knock somebody's socks off. And I don't think that's what significant means in this case. Let me contrast it with something that I think would be insignificant. There was a British philosopher called A.J. Ayer, who worked in the 20th century, now died, and unfortunately, when he became elderly, he became increasingly demented. And while he was still a professor at Oxford, talking to people, he said that he was involved in a research project in which he could calculate the number of angels that could stand on the head of a pin. Now, in my opinion, this would be an insignificant piece of research, not from a religious point of view, but because there is a real risk that there is only one person in the world who wants to know the answer to this question, and it's Ayer himself. So what's missing in this research is the potential, only needs to be potential, for impact. So significant means that it has the potential to have some kind of impact on a group of people. One person is too small, not a group. Doesn't have to be the assembled masses. Goodness, that's very dark, isn't it? Sorry. That's an orchestra preparing to play the Mahler, the big one, where you have lots of forces on it. I thought it would be good for music, but there's a bit lost on the camera there. There you go. So it needs to have the potential to impact a group of people. It needs to have the potential to alter the way that your peers, I'm assuming this group are your peers, alter the way that they work, the way that they think about something. So things are going to be changed by this research, but only a modest number of people, not the entire population. Another thing we can infer from that is that you do have to disseminate your work. So if you are a lone genius and you compose music and you only play it to yourself in a locked room, or an artist, you never exhibit your work, all of these things tend to mitigate against this having an effect as a work of research. You might intend that it's research, but my personal view, we'll come on to my personal views in a moment, is that whether something is research or not is nothing to do with what you want it to be, it's to do with how it's received. If it's received as a work of research, in other words, it makes a difference to people, then I think that counts as research. So it may be a painting or a piece of music that was not composed with being a work of research as its intention. Conversely, somebody may be working dead hard and perhaps even doing a PhD and doing their best to create a piece of research. But if it's the equivalent of counting angels on the head of a pin, then it's not going to be a work of research no matter how much you want it to be. Okay, we can come back to that because I'm sure you'd like to disagree. Okay, original. How original does it have to be? Does it have to change the world? Are you going to get a Nobel Prize for this? Is there a Nobel Prize for music? There isn't one for that. No?
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either. So, how original does it have to be? Well, I think the key thing about originality, let's not look at how crazily different it is. Let's look in the opposite direction. How crazily the same is it? If it's the same as something that's gone before, it is not original. So one of the important things that you can do as a researcher is be very well informed about what everybody else has already done. That's already kind of the main thing that you need to do. After that, what you're going to do is original. We can come back to this. Contribution. Does it have to completely knock the socks off people so they are speechless? Well, I don't think so. I've said already it has to be shared. I think it has to be shared. So we are talking about there being a group of people. So to contribute something, I think by definition you need to share it. Not a contribution if you keep it in your pocket. It's a contribution if you put it out there. And you've got to put it out there in a way that's meaningful. If I say I brought some sweets to share and I put it in a bowl and I put plastic film over the top and I put it on the table but it's very near me and none of you can reach it, and if you do I glare at you, then that's not really sharing. It's got to be meaningfully shared. So it needs to be disseminated and shared to people in a way they can access it, in a way that they can use it. And one of the things that's implied now, I think, by all of these three categories and what criteria and what they should be and what they shouldn't be, is that your own personal, emotional expression is perhaps not the place to start in a work of research, because it belongs to you. It's difficult to share that. It's perhaps not very impactful. After all, who apart from your mother cares about your internal life? So there are a lot of reasons not to start with your own emotional expression as a good place to start with a work of research. I think that can come into it, but we'll talk about that later on. It's perhaps not the source. So what I've been talking about, I think, is that there are choices to be made here according to your interpretational stance, so you'll already be heading off in a certain direction, what you expect to do, how you expect to do it. And so I'd like to just highlight a few things, and then we can stop for a bit of a chat perhaps. A few of the choices that you definitely have before you even start. So while on day one of the doctoral programme, before you get on the bus to go to the Orpheus Institute, you can already be thinking about these things. There's more than one model of what research is doing. I'm assuming that research is something to do with finding new knowledge, if we can use those words without getting too worried about exactly what they mean. So what would finding new knowledge be like? Well, one model, one analogy is that it's like a bucket of water. What we're doing is we're dripping new knowledge. Every PhD thesis is a little drip in the bucket. And we can see from that each little drip is quite small compared to the bucket of water that we've got, the bucket of knowledge that we've got. But it's gradually getting fuller and fuller. And actually there's an implication here, I suppose, that will come to the point when the bucket is full. Now that is a model of scientific research. If we have a model that what we are doing is finding out what the world is really like, there will come a point where we know what the world is really like. It might take a very long time. I also thought after I'd made this image that Maybe it's one of those graphs that gradually gets nearer and nearer to the axis but never actually gets there. So maybe our drips get a bit smaller towards the end, till they're very small, so the bucket never actually overflows. But it's nearly there, isn't it? And certainly this metaphor is that in the old days we didn't know much and our bucket was empty. And now we know more than we did then, and in the future we'll know more than we do now. And maybe one day we'll know everything there is to know about everything. There is in physics the theory of everything. I'm deeply suspicious of something that calls itself the theory of everything. Because there are other models of knowledge. The next model is completely different. If we think of knowledge as a snowball, we can go on rolling that around and more bits of snow, and some of our unlucky colleagues get stuck to the snowball and it gets bigger and bigger and there's no end to it. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We never finish making that snowball. But it is bigger. We had a smaller snowball in the beginning. Now we've got a medium-sized snowball. Who knows how big the snowball's going to go? That's a different metaphor for what it is to add knowledge. There isn't an end to that. That is much more of a metaphor for interpretation, I think. We can go on interpreting things, we can go back to things that we've already interpreted and interpret them again, and again and again and again, and there's no end to it. And it's okay, it doesn't. The old ones are not made redundant, but you're gradually accumulating interpretations. But I actually prefer another metaphor, which is that I think knowledge is like a bus. The bus is always full. People get on and people get off. So the bus is always full. It's not always full of the same people. So there's an exchange. Some ideas come, some ideas go. So I want to put forward some other visual metaphors and then I'll stop for a little bit. Those were about models of knowledge. So what is knowledge and understanding like? Now I want to look at, well, how would you look? If you think that you're investigating reality, this is a sort of scientific approach, I think the metaphor is the microscope. The microscope enables you to see smaller and smaller things, to dig down deep to find out what are things really like, what are things made of, ideas as well as physical objects, okay? It's a metaphor. And you get a bigger and more powerful one. The CERN Hadron Collider in Switzerland and France is a huge manifestation of exactly this. It's a kind of enormous microscope, a ridiculously large piece of equipment for looking at ridiculously small things. Because one of the things that these scientists, while they're busy looking in the microscope, if there's a lion in the room behind them, they're not going to see it. So we could think about this the other way around. Huh? We could look out. We could all the time think, well, to find out more about what we don't understand, instead of looking in an increasingly narrow way, we could look the other way. What's a different theory? What's a different way of thinking about this? The idea of paradigm shifts in science. Let's think about this differently. That's another metaphor. How we could go about it if we've got a problem. I think philosophy quite often approaches problems in that way. And then there's the metaphor that this is not really about external reality at all. This is all about us. All of these ideas, these theories, these attitudes come from inside us, our psychology, how it's all mediated by being a human being. So constructionists would think that we're projecting, we're creating the world. So it's a bit pointless to look outside. It's got to do much more with the structure of thinking. So those are ways of looking. What about where to look? We can think that knowledge comes from the genius, the individual person, the creative mind, a person, an individual. Or we could think that achievement and knowledge comes from teamwork, when people get together, groups of people, perhaps even societies, cultures. And they've got a common activity, so they're putting their efforts together, in this case, making a building. Can you see enough of these? Can you see them all right? Can you just about make out what they are, these images?
I can close the windows.
Yeah, that'd be good. Because this one in particular is a bit complicated.
It takes only half an hour.
I'll keep talking.
It makes a noise when they want to know.
So the metaphor here is that rather than being an individual, rather than being a group of people, it's something, the spirit of the time. There's something in the age, the zeitgeist, that doesn't belong to an individual person or even a group of people that they know about explicitly, but that there's something in the air. So these would all alter where you would go to find evidence or argument, allies, opponents. What about the tools that you need? You reach for something. I've always been struck that when artists start with a piece of paper and a pencil, already they have determined a lot of what they're going to be able to do. It's flat, you can make marks, you're not going to make a piece of sculpture, it's not going to end up being a piece of music. So a lot of fairly unconscious activities coming to a place like this, calling yourself a musician, these things are already narrowing the field tremendously, almost more than any subsequent decisions. So if you reach for one of these things, you'll know the name of it and I don't, you're going to get a certain kind of sound, of a completely different kind to this, which strikes me as being, I was looking at the Steinway and thinking the same thing actually, that both the violin and the Steinway are a tremendous formalisation of a musical sound. This is saying that this complex machine will produce something that is authentically a musical sound as opposed to just a noise. And of course, bits of equipment change. The point is that with each of these things, you are going to get a different sound, a different set of potentials. And so by choosing one, you have implicitly rejected the others. And then what kind of thing are we going to find out by these forms of inquiry? Monet worked away, painting many times over, the light effects on Rouen Cathedral. Well, that's a kind of scientific inquiry, I suppose. It focused very much on isolating a variable, the variable of sunlight. So he didn't change his position, and the paintings all represent the same building, the same view, all that's changing is the light. Very scientific approach. Something like Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds seems to me approaches this differently. Instead of adding to the body of sound, now what we're doing is recognising that a piece of music has got a beginning and an end. It's a kind of envelope in which certain things happen. So if we keep the envelope, we take out the contents, that's going to do something different. That's going to focus our attention on something different, perhaps something that we hadn't focused our attention on before. And then Alexander McQueen's fashion. What kind of thing is that telling us? Well, I think this is telling us a lot about contemporary society, about the relationship that visual art, and perhaps performance and theatre, has to everyday life. So instead of being confined in the art gallery, confined in the theatre, this is coming out now into the catwalk. This isn't like the Bauhaus dance experiments done in a laboratory. This is done on a catwalk with potential to have some impact on what people are wearing, sort of bringing sculpture out into everyday culture. So we've got a number of different things, a number of different choices that are in principle choices. And these are the in principle choices that I think visual arts have been struggling with over the last 20 years. Which of these are the most useful in principle choices to make? So that if you have an institute like this, if you're running a doctoral program, when the students come in and there's this horrendous infinite possibility of things to do, how do you close it down in ways that encourage the creative activity but optimise the potential that that activity is going to have to act as research? And not everybody's making the same choices